Hello, I'm Alex and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. What was the cause of the Bengal Famine? How did Great Britain manage this humanitarian crisis? And who were its key players? Today's History Chronicle begins in British India in 1943. In August 1765, the East India Company, a British trading company, signed the Treaty of Allahabad with the young Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, who was forced to give away the major land concession of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, officially starting British rule in India. The East India Company would then build Fort Williams, which eventually would become Calcutta, the de facto capital of India, until 1911. It is important to note at this time that the territory was officially held by the East India Company, as it was a private endeavour, but it was backed by the British government. Besides the territorial concessions, the East India Company received exclusive Diwani rights, or the privilege to collect taxes on behalf of the Mughal Emperor. The East India Company was ruthless collecting taxes, collecting 2.6 million rupees worth of taxes, equating to £34 million in today's money. Despite the East India Company taking over the tax collection, Clive of India, who had become the first British governor of the Bengal Presidency, ensured that the East India Company was far removed from the process, whose role was to simply rubber stamp the process, as taxes were collected from the Murshidabad offices, which were staffed by Mughal officials, though British officials worked behind the scenes and made all the decisions. This made the East India Company the first trading corporation to be both a colonial proprietor and a corporate state. The company was free to make laws, tax, mint coins, make peace, or wage war, as they were essentially a sovereign nation. This new territory and the taxes which came from land revenue would be pure profit for the company. Some of this tax revenue would pay for the entirety of Great Britain's China tea obsession, along with paying for any other needs within India, and there would still be money left over. Yet the financial gains of the East India Company would soon come to an end, as the monsoon season of 1768 barely brought any rain, and by 1769, no rain at all. As a result, the rivers dried up and the pukas, or fish ponds, which were positioned in the centre of every Bengali village, turned to dust. Company officials noted the change in weather and worried about their profits, as the price of rice rose and the farmers were unable to prepare the fields for the next season. Some Murshidabad officials even reported families selling children to raise money to buy food. By February 1770, 70% of the rice was lost and the price had risen by a factor of 10. From July to September, 76,000 people died of starvation in Calcutta alone, and while the numbers are disputed, it is estimated that 1.2 million died of starvation, or roughly 1 out of every 5 Bengalis. Famines and drought had been a regular occurrence throughout India's history, yet the East India Company failed to address the problems. For centuries, the Mughal administration system had worked to mitigate the effects of famine through the use of grain stores, public works, and famine relief measures to lessen the burden. Even at this time, Mughal administrators were trying to lessen the impact of the famine by importing rice and setting up gruel kitchens, while only a couple of company officials policed the hoarding of rice and prevented its exportation. Yet from 1770 to 1771, East India Company officials transferred roughly £100 million in today's currency back to London at the height of the famine. It wouldn't be until the end of 1771, when word finally reached London concerning the company's behaviour in India, that an investigation would be started. Even before the start of the investigation, the public and press had been nipping at the heels of the East India Company for answers regarding their management of India. Following Parliament's investigation and with the insistence of Lord North, the Regulating Act of 1773 were passed, as a result of which the British government took control of the administration of former East India Company lands. A Governor-General was appointed, who oversaw a small council, though the council was often in utter gridlock. The governor also lacked any power of veto, which exaggerated the problem. Ultimately, it was the beginning of the end for the East India Company's rule over India, which effectively ended in 1858. Even with the removal of the East India Company from the administration of India, now known as the British Raj, famines would still plague India, like the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. But the invention of the railroad and its introduction to India nearly eliminated famine from India during peacetime. Yet in 1939, Great Britain had declared war on Germany for the invasion of Poland, pulling the might of the empire into conflict with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. War readiness drills were conducted across the empire, though not everyone was prepared for the reality of war. Air raid drills were conducted in Calcutta, yet the populace seemed unfazed by the threat of conflict. Nazi Germany was seen as too far away to be a threat to India, but the Empire of Japan was looming in the distance. When Winston Churchill assumed the position of Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, he immediately took control of the war effort. During his time as England's First Lord of the Admiralty, he oversaw the blockade of Germany, turning all of Germany into a beleaguered fortress. He and other British war planners knew how hunger could be used as a weapon in modern warfare, and how a nation's food security was a high priority. In fact, Great Britain had already started a subcommittee in the summer of 1936 to deal with rationing under Sir William Beveridge. As soon as war was announced, the Second Ministry of Food was established, along with the distribution of ration books which had been printed ahead of war. Sugar, butter, ham and bacon were the first to be rationed in January of 1940. By March, meat, tea and margarine were added to the list, while in 1941 preserves and cheese were included, along with cloth. This foresight of the British government resulted in the improvement of its public's health. But despite this, England failed to form an initiative with its colonies. In India, the only source of monitoring food supply was the Bengal Famine Code, first written in 1897 and only updated in 1905 and 1913. From the code, there were 6 common signs indicating famine, including the limited effectiveness of private charities for the poor, the shrinking of credit, increased activity in the grain trade, increase of crime, increased movement of herds looking for pastures, and lastly, the wandering of people. When multiple signs were observed, a famine commissioner was appointed, and the test works were to be opened. Test works were labour camps for the poor, and if a significant amount of people applied, a famine would be declared. The Famine Code also took into account the extent to which imperial aid was likely to be required, along with whether the land revenue tax needed to be suspended. While the Bengal Famine Code covered many of the basics of resolving food scarcity problems, other concerns needed to be addressed for full war readiness, including the bolstering of the defences of India. The British Empire primarily relied on volunteers for the defence of India, and as a result, priority for food was given to the civilian military members. Yet, despite receiving food priority, supporting the war effort was seen as being a colonial collaborator. This anti-colonial sentiment was a result of the Viceroy declaring war on India's behalf in 1939, only increasing resentment towards British rule. While the cities were abuzz with independence movements, the rural regions were more concerned with basic survival rather than the war effort. Malaria had struck India in the early 1930s, depopulating key economic sectors and devastating the fishing industry. As well as being crippled by disease, many peasants were in debt due to the commercializing of grain. Farmers were unable to escape the cycle of debt and repayment, and by the late 1930s, the rural credit market crashed. This was partially due to the Great Depression, but it was at the point when the poor were already at their breaking point with starvation. Further complications to the war effort came when Japan threatened the important naval base at Singapore. It was guarded by light military forces due to Churchill's preference of fighting against Italy and Germany in the Middle East. When Japan launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, British colonial possessions in Southeast Asia were also attacked and invaded. Singapore and other major holdings surrendered on the 15th of February 1942, leaving India wide open to attack with the surrender of 130,000 British troops, including many Indian forces. Since the beginning of the war with Japan in 1941, the price of rice had risen by 75%, as did exports from Bengal. In January of 1942, 45,000 tons of rice were exported, and only 3 months later, in April, 66,000 tons of rice was exported. Refugees exasperated the problem, as nearly 600,000 fled from Burma into India, in combination with the rural poor flooding to the cities looking to escape the economic hardship. On the 3rd of March 1942, as a result of the increased war effort, the government of India advised the Bengal Chamber of Commerce to encourage employers to store 3 months' worth of food to feed its workers. This was due to their need to plan and was not a direct indication of famine. Yet the warning signs were becoming clear. Besides the inner city needs, the rural farmers cultivated a cycle of crops, which often resulted in 3 months of feasting, 5 months of subsistence diet, and 4 months of starvation. This was a problem even before the war, but it would be exaggerated during it. By late December of 1942, the stocks of rice were dwindling, and the bombing of Calcutta by the Japanese increased the difficulty of imports. In an effort to alleviate the problems, any shops which remained shuttered following the all-clear sign were to be broken into and their goods distributed, specifically the stores with food goods. By January 1943, Calcutta started to see an increase in beggars, one of the first signs of famine according to the famine codes. Many of the top officials in India urged the importing of 600,000 tons of food, yet Leopold Amery, Secretary of State for India, stated it would be impossible, as the imports would cost too much to the war effort. The War Cabinet met and decided they could only afford to send 130,000 tons of food, but that it would only be available to send in April, and in an effort to bring more food into Bengal, Ceylon would trade their rice wheat for Bengal's rice. Although Ceylon's food situation was also dire, it was an attempt to bring relief to India in the short term. On the 18th of May 1943, the last source of famine control was removed when trade barriers between provincial neighbours were discontinued upon the insistence of the Government of India. This released the floodgates on accountability over the food crisis, as bulk purchases destabilised the region's food supplies. Prices skyrocketed and the extreme poor were pushed out of the market, as buying agents flooded from Bengal into neighbouring regions, buying up food stocks. As a result, many districts reported increased deaths from starvation in May of 1943. By June, food drives were announced by the government of Bengal in an effort to bring food to the needy, by seizing illegal traders not licensed under Food Grains Control Order. Other efforts to reduce the death toll included temporary collection centres, which could house and feed up to 8,000 of the destitute, although many Indians believed these centres were a trick, and that they would be sent to the front as a sacrifice for the war effort. Once in the facility, the destitutes would refuse food, steal blankets, and try to escape. As a consequence, these centres were ineffective, which led to the government determining who had a right to Calcutta. Destitutes who did not have a claim to Calcutta were removed, which often meant life or death for them. Starvation itself does not result in the withering of the body, but instead, quote, deforms and annihilates the bodies and mind that it is allowed to prey upon. It is a process of deterioration, as the body becomes weakened and organs fail one after another. During the Bengal famine, some of the poor souls who suffered did not only endure the famine, as they could also be inflicted with sores, ulcers, scabies, malaria, cholera, smallpox, and parasites, though the ultimate cause of death was starvation. When Archibald Wavell was sworn in as the Viceroy on the 20th of October 1943, he instantly established a distress relief fund, and appeared to be the first British official to view the loss of innocent life in Bengal as a priority. While the end of 1943 is stated officially as the end of the famine, studies show many of the deaths attributed to the 1943 famine actually occurred in 1944. Wavell continued to fight the War Cabinet for relief, but it was determined by Churchill and the Minister for War Transport, Lord Leathers, that the shipping needs would be hard to meet, and they questioned the statistics of the famine. Wavell was enraged and again implored them to help by providing aid, and ultimately the War Cabinet approved 200,000 tons of food, only 1/6 of India's needs. On the 31st of July 1944, the Royal Commission to inquire into the Bengal famine of 1943 was convened in Delhi to investigate the cause of the famine. A panel examined the evidence and heard witness testimony in an effort to understand the economic, political, and social context of the famine. As a result, it was determined there was inadequate mill capacity, a lack of proper storage facilities, and the transportation services were entirely deficient. It was also determined that the staff of the Civil Supplies Department were unorganised. As a consequence of these failures, the price of rice had inflated, causing the famine to occur. While the Commission's report was done with extreme diligence and the use of many witnesses, many modern-day scholars are quick to blame Winston Churchill alone for the Bengal famine, arguing that many of the rural poor were already at the point of starvation in the 1930s due to the crop credit system crashing. They also claimed that the War Cabinet and Churchill did neglect their duty to their subjects in India in order to advance their war goals. It is also argued that the Indian nationalist leaders, who often led major industrial operations which Great Britain depended on for the war effort, were concerned for their profits rather than the plight of their people. On top of both British and Indian nationalist leaders' policy failures, the stress of war on an already fragile system resulted in the death of 3 to 5 million people. In contrast to this, other historians state that as the fate of the entire world was hanging in the balance, the British and Churchill can hardly be labelled as intentionally causing or perpetuating the famine, especially when diverting much-needed supplies to alleviate the crisis may have resulted in military reverses against the Axis powers and Japan, which in themselves may have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands and even millions, especially if major battles or even the war had been lost. It is also stated by some that those who blame the British may be innocent of how its empire operated, with virtually all colonies and dominions throughout the empire having varying degrees of self-governance. Thus, the responsibility for the famine should lie with the local authorities in India itself, as the British Empire was, in fact, a coalition of dominions rather than a centralised imperial state ruled from London. Although Churchill and his war cabinet did eventually divert supplies to help the situation, there is no denying that by modern standards, Churchill did have racial prejudices that would now be seen as unacceptable. But to what degree this affected his thinking during the crisis is unclear. And like so much in history, it remains a matter of conjecture and opinion, not fact. As well as this, those who defend Churchill are quick to point out that no blame is ever ascribed to the Japanese Empire, whose invasion of Burma was the major cause of the start of the crisis, as it cut off food supplies to Bengal, which combined with a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal itself, doubtless made a bad situation in the area much worse. In short, the Bengal famine will almost certainly forever be a subject that divides opinion, with Indian and Bangladeshi nationalists using the lack of assistance from Britain as justification of independence and labelling the British and Churchill as evil genocidal killers, whilst the British in contrast refute such claims as too simplistic, inaccurate and biased. The truth, we suspect, as so often in history, lies somewhere in the middle. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to see what you think of the Bengal famine. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.